Good morning, Ada Bulldogs. Here is time for your next lesson. This one's going to be on the Renaissance. And yes, you have to say it just like that, the Renaissance. Everybody practice with me one more time. Just kidding. That's kind of corny. So anyways, so your next set of notes is on the Renaissance. This is right after us talking about the Black Death, and you also have problems with these countries trying to take over each other, like England and France. And now all of a sudden you have this thing called the Renaissance coming in a little bit after the time period of Black Death, where things start to change a little bit. So let's talk about what's coming up first of all, before we get our set notes. So you have your set notes today. On Wednesday, you're going to have a little video on Marco. You better say it, Polo. And also I want you to start to look at your quiz list because you are about due for a vocabulary quiz. Still going to try to manage to have one. It'll be more of the honor code, I guess, on this, just to keep you up on it so that when we do have a test of some fashion that you'll be up on your vocabulary words. And then, let's see, we'll start vernacular writings, which I do enjoy. We're actually getting towards the end of what we would typically have in the classroom, because once we get to exploration, then we are all done. And we start prepping for next year and doing some projects. So honestly, I'm going to have to stretch things out just a little bit, but we'll make do and, well, power through April and May as best as we can, if that's as long as we're actually going to be doing this. So anyways, let's do your set of notes now, because I know you're like, stop rambling and start doing notes. Okay, I will. So here you go. Okay, so I don't know why that didn't go all the way to the beginning. So stop looking at this, quit cheating. All right, here we go. Don't worry about the video there. That I'll have a link to you in the comments anyways on this. So anyway, so Renaissance is this time period that means rebirth itself. Renaissance or renew or rebirth means that there has been something currently, and then it's going to change for whatever purpose. It could be because the Black Death came and pretty much wiped everything out, or it could be that you just needed to go in a different direction or whatever. So Renaissance has been used several times in history. It's not just the Middle Ages, but usually that's what we think of when we hear it, like the Renaissance Fair that they had down by Cincinnati every year, usually in the fall, if you have a chance to go there. But I gave you a picture here of what's called the Harlem Renaissance. Is a time period during the 1930s and 40s when you had Harlem became a place for arts, for writers, for famous musicians in the Great Apollo Theater that's there. You have Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Louis Armstrong, all musicians and singers in their own right. So Renaissance can be used still even today, but when we do talk about it historically, it usually does mean this time period between 1315 and 1550. Now, first of all, that's a 200-year time period. So you're going to be like, yeah, that's a lot of generations. Yeah, you're right. But Renaissance does not change instantly. It takes a lot of time, especially if during this time period you have wars going on, but also you have the Black Death coming in. It's going to take a long time for all that stuff to get worked out. And then society does change. So what that means is people had a renewed interest in art and learning. So once, if you think about society, if everything's a hot mess, and you could use like modern times for today as an example, things are a hot mess, and then you get through that hot mess, and then things can change for the positive. Society goes in a different direction. Like maybe after this, we do focus on medicine and insurance and unemployment and things like that, instead of other things that maybe don't reflect upon society as much. But we learn where our weak spots are, and then we have time to think about them and then possibly change them. And so that's what happens during this time period, is this Renaissance, is people had that renewed interest in arts and learning, which they didn't have before because, well, they had the Black Plague, they had a lot of war. So when those things go on, your more creative sides of society tend to weaken. And you also have the idea that people thought that they could make a difference and change the world for the better. It could be, again, in arts, it could be in medicine, different things that we'll talk about throughout this unit. But also people had, and this is a vocabulary word, had the idea of things becoming more secular. Now it's secular, not anything else that you might think it might be, secular. That simply means that it's something of the world rather than religion in heaven. What I mean by this is where you have a very religious society at the time period in Europe, when it comes to arts and the writings, a lot of the early stuff was on religion, and your art was on religion. But then all of that, I don't say all of it changes, but people go a different direction. Is when they write and when they paint or sculpt or whatever, that it's not necessarily all about religion. And so it doesn't mean that it's satanic or of the devil or anything like that. It just means it's almost a way to group art. Is it secular or is it of the church? Again, not necessarily such a bad thing, but it could be, I guess, it's different time periods. So what we're looking at is this Renaissance is taking off in these places that we've talked about before. Like you have, we've had this map before of Venice and of Florence, and this is where the Renaissance takes off. So think about it. Why would Venice and Florence have the Renaissance really first in those places? Correct. It is because they were so wealthy. And where you have wealth, you have opportunity for people to pay others to paint and to also do different types of writings and pay them. And it would be for buildings and other structures and things like that. So where you have money, that's where the Renaissance really starts to grow. And as this note point says here, and you already had Roman and Greek influences existing there. Now, what that means is that you already had people who were into the writings and of the, oops, sorry about that, I touched the screen and something on there. That you had influences of Roman and Greek writing and art there. So when people have money, they tend to spend it on, could be frivolous things, it could be pretty things. And in this case, that's what they did because the money was there. They spent it. The pictures that you're seeing, a couple of these, you had the people back here, the king, queen. This is all Renaissance fair stuff. So these are modern pictures of people dressing of that time period. So wealthy people could pay for artists, painters, and architects for their great works. And we'll talk about some of these famous people here in a couple of note sets. We look at writings and we look at artists as well. But that's what they became known for, is having these things of materialistic goods, we might call them, in modern times. And since you had people who had that money, you had a couple things. You had people being able to be more creative because people would pay them for their ideas, but also you had competition between one another. You think about modern times, and maybe not necessarily cities, but perhaps people or different groups that compete against each other and who has the biggest and the best. You can see that in like automobiles, see that in like electronics or even homes or things like that, that everybody wants to have the most toys, the biggest and the best. And that's what happens in these city-states. That again, when they start to have that money, then they end up spending it on different things. And so the Renaissance really takes off from those points. So let's talk back again about these city-states that are now starting to pop up more prevalently around especially areas of wealth, like Florence here, and we said Venice. These were early city-states, and we'll talk about city-states since the beginning with Greece, with Greece, that would be better, or with Greeks. But city-states are independent areas, yet part of a larger community or country. Almost you can think of it like a state, like how you have states that are now dealing with the coronavirus, but they still rely on the national government for support. Like Ohio yesterday was trying to get, there's a group in Columbus that is making or disinfecting some masks, making some masks, but then the FDA came in and said that they could only do so many. And so Governor DeWine called President Trump and said, you need to get on the FDA to approve as many as we can of these masks. And it actually went through. So even though we can be independent as a state, we end up relying on the national government, and we're not separate. We're just kind of our own entity at times. And some of these could be as big as countries in terms of wealth. And they were wealthy through their trade. They had their own armies. So like, again, Florence and Venice, and they were so rich that they could end up loaning money to kings, which you still had during this feudal time period. Most of these early city-states were along the coast, and this goes back to the very beginning. It makes sense, especially if they're into trade, that they're going to be able to have access to water, access to land. So that's why if you look up here, there's where a lot of your dots are, because not only can they get internally into Europe, but also can get there by way of land or water as well. So most of your city-states are going to be located near water. What also helped was a trade with the Arabs, Arab merchants or Arab nations. That would be for your Arabian countries like Saudi Arabia to the east. That silk trade opens up with trade with Asia. In your Crusades, we didn't talk about them. I kind of condensed the note sets with all the stuff that's going on now. But your Crusades were when you had battles between the Christians and the Muslims, so east versus west, over the Holy Lands and such. That's in short what Crusades were about. But from a negative thing, which the Crusades really were, to a positive is that it introduced Europe to a lot of different trade entities or items or groups from the Middle East and vice versa, so that they started to trade even more on that Silk Road. And because of that, you start to have people who are more interested in what's in the East, or what they used to call the Far East back in the day. And so this is where this guy named Marco Polo comes in. Wait, I didn't do that right. Here's where this guy named Marco, and I hope everybody said that, Polo, comes in. And no, this is not just a game that you play in the pool. This is an actual guy. And we know that he was important because he's rocking the beard of wisdom there. So you have this guy named Marco Polo, who realizes that the the Far East, is pretty much untraveled by Europeans. They don't know anything about it. So he decides that he's going to go out and travel. And we'll talk more about this guy later, but just to give you a little bit of a synopsis on because of writings. We'll hit him in the writing section too in a little bit. But he starts to travel and look at this route that he has from 1271 to 1295. So the better part of 20 years plus, he's traveling into the Far East and literally going the Far East over here. And then traveling down through China, traveling through Asia, and coming back up here through the Middle East, and then back to Europe. And that's going to be important because what he does is he travels, he gets permission by the leader of China at the time named Kublai Khan, who wants to show him all the goods of the Eastern world. And so he writes this stuff down, he brings stuff back with him. And when he does that, he ends up writing a book called I believe it's just the journal or the Journey of Marco Polo, even though this child's book was called Adventures of Marco Polo. But he goes and writes that book, and it comes back and becomes a bestseller, what we would consider a bestseller in modern times, because people had never heard of this stuff before. They were really interested in it, of the silks and the spices and the buildings that he saw and the people that he met and all these things. So it was literally a different world for the Europeans. And so by way of Marco Polo, they're able to become interested in this. And what it does is it opens up travel. It opens up trade. It's a race between these European countries who hear the stories and say, hey, I want this stuff. Even something as simple as like spices for food, because European food was, well, pretty bland. And so just by coming back and writing about the spices and the food that he has, people are like, okay, we want some of that stuff too. So this is important, this travel of Marco Polo, and come back and to write about it and get people interested in what the world is like outside of their own little bubble, I suppose, of what would be Europe. And so some of these city-states would include two that we've mentioned already when we talked about trade and travel. Well, now, because of that trade and travel, these groups, they become more prevalent, more prominent during this time period. And again, that Renaissance really hits them. So first one, again, we'll cover both of them, is Florence, Italy. There's a modern picture of Florence, Italy. Fans of the Assassin's Creed series will recognize this because you actually were in Florence and you climbed up to this big dome in that video game. But Florence, just to recap, their wealth came from trading of wool and then making the fabrics from it. So I always like this picture because here you have a sheep, native sheep, riding a sheep. So wool, made of wool, riding wool. Yeah, it's kind of like Inception, kind of mind-blowing. But anyways, they become very rich and wealthy because of the trading of wool. And then because of it, they have so much money, they start to develop banking, which really started with the Islamic countries in Turkey a little while ago, and we talked about that in a set of notes, and they start measuring the value of money. Now that becomes important because with banking and the value of money, as they start lending money to other people, they start charging interest in it, which is what we have in modern times in banking today. So that really goes back to Florence during this time of the Renaissance. Second one is called Venice, which again we mentioned before. Venice being famous today for having the canals that's all throughout the city that you can go on. And they were considered to be the wealthiest of all city-states, and this was the home of Marco Polo. So here's where he was able to go and then travel throughout the Middle East because he had financial backing from people who wanted to know what was there. So I'm not sure about this picture. These guys are not really to scale very much, or they're just really giant and their building is really small. But anyways, your Venetians, who we'd mentioned before, were shipbuilders and sailors. So they found a need that people had, and then they were able to meet that need and were be able to become wealthy off of it. It doesn't necessarily mean that they needed all the boats themselves, but by being builders and having sailors, sailor ships, then they were able to make some money off of that from other people's needs as well. And the very last thing for this point, for this note set, is they also built canals. There's an overhead view of what Venice looks like today. This is a city that in modern times has some concern, just in case the flooding might occur and might damage a lot of Venice, or if the sea rises, that could be a problem too. So anyways, what we're going to look at in your next section of notes is the effect in terms of society for the Renaissance. So now that these groups have all this money, what does it mean? Well, it's going to make some changes in terms of literature, focus of literature, and I really like these next note sets because they're fun to talk about, but also like your artists, famous artists that you might know of from these older times. So in other words, if you got the money, you're going to be able to spend it. So there you go. So there's your note set. Again, you do not have to turn in your notes. It's entirely up to you on whether you fill them out or not. You can always go back and listen to this PowerPoint again if you really are that bored, I suppose. But do remember to look over your vocabulary words that are on your Quizlet. If you do not have access to Quizlet, all you have to do is search for Mr. Steyer, no periods, no spaces, on Quizlet, and then just join in the world history class. And you should be able to get in. But we did that at the beginning of the year. So anyways, enough rambling from me. Thanks for paying attention for a good 18 minutes or so. Hopefully you learned something from this and we can move forward. So have a good day, and I'll talk to you soon.